This talk is going to be about the first chapter of my dissertation, and it's about hydrologic sensitivity to changes in climate and land use in the Santiam River Basin in Oregon. My study objectives are to identify how patterns of hydrologic variability vary within subbasins that contribute to hydrologic sensitivity to changes in climate and land use, to identify which subbasins will experience vulnerability to water scarcity in the future, and to explore how elevation, intensity of groundwater demand, intensity of water demands, intensity of groundwater interactions, all factors that contribute to hydrologic sensitivity, relate to vulnerability to water scarcity. So why the Santiam River Basin? Well, because it has a wide range of topographic, geological, and hydrologic conditions that make it useful to make comparisons between two different hydrologic sensitivities, such as the North Santiam and the South Santiam Basin. It encompasses 4,700 square kilometers of the eastern portion of the Willamette River Basin. And this map over here shows the geology of the area. This brown section represents the high Cascades. The tan color represents the western Cascades. And the light blue color represents the alluvial areas of the Willamette River Basin. And the elevation in this basin ranges between 50 meters at the confluence of the Willamette River to 3,200 meters at the summit of Mount Jefferson. Another interesting characteristic of this basin is that 80% of the precipitation falls between October and April. And it's characterized by rain below 350 meters, rain and snow between 350 meters and 1,100 meters, and snow above 1,100 meters. There's 4 dams in this basin that are operated by the Army Corps of Engineers, Detroit and Big Cliff in the North Santiam, and Green Peter and Foster in the South Santiam. I want to point some very interesting difference between the two basins. The North Santiam has about 700 square kilometers less than the South Santiam, and it's drained by the high and western Cascades. The South Santiam is drained only by the western Cascades. The geology of both subbasins are very different. The North Santiam is characterized by high permeability with deep aquifers, and the South Santiam has low permeability and low connectivity to the aquifer. The geology in the North Santiam is substantial groundwater recharge and sustained base flows. In the South Santiam is shallow surface and subsurface flow with rapid runoff response. The North Santiam Basin is mostly forested in the upstream, in the up parts of the basin, and has a little bit agriculture and range areas in the bottom parts. The South Santiam on the other side has less forested areas compared to the North Santiam and has more agriculture and urban areas compared to the North. We obtain estimates of what future water supply from a study made by Surfleet and Toulouse that use geoflow projections. Geoflow is a coupled groundwater surface water model, and climate change was simulated within geoflow using 8 different GCMs and 2 greenhouse gas emission scenarios. And data was statistically downscaled using bias correction and spatial downscaling. The output that I obtained from my analysis is a mean monthly streamflow from geoflow simulations that represents the 2.5, 50, and 97.5 percentiles. Then we also obtain analysis of projections of land use from the Pacific Northwest Ecosystem Research Consortium, and we simulated within geoflow under 2 different scenarios: conservation and development. Conservation scenario assumes a more restrictive development policies, emphasizing ecosystem restoration and protection, increasing in forest areas, and more restrictions in urban growth boundaries. Development scenario is a more aggressive one, reflects the loosening of current policies, also less restrictions to urban and rural residential uses. To investigate how patterns vary within each basin, we chose 6 locations in the basin that are shown in this map over here. based on different geology, water sources, and also data availability from GS flow analysis. And we calculate for two different time periods. Current time period from 1960 to 2010, and the future time period from 2030 to 2059. And calculated three different metrics: the percent change in mean monthly runoff depth, the percent change in annual runoff depth, and the annual streamflow variability. We also assessed vulnerability to water scarcity. We consider an area to be vulnerable to water scarcity when demand is greater than supply. That is, when the ratio of supply and demand is below 1. We consider demand to be the streamflow projections from GS flow as the upper, lower, and median confidence interval and existing storage. We consider demand to be consumptive uses and in-stream uses. Consumptive uses account for irrigation, municipal, industrial, domestic, and commercial. And in-stream uses account for scenic waterways and water rights. So results from the hydrologic responses. The percent change in monthly runoff depth projections showed that across the entire basin, the percent change in runoff depth is going to decline during the summer months, and it's going to increase during the winter months for almost all basins, with the exception of Waterloo. But we also saw that the magnitude of changes, of the changes vary within each subbasin, and this is happening because of the different characteristics of land use changes and each different scenario. So for example, if you take into account, if we focus only on the north and the south Antillean Basin at the mouth, what we see is that they both are experiencing increases in winter runoff. However, the increase for the south Antillean Basin, which is the green line over there, is higher than the increase for the north Antillean. And the same happens on the summer months, where the south Antillean is experiencing larger decreases in summer runoff. And this is for the A1B scenario, which is the more aggressive, but we found the same results on the B1 scenario. However, the difference between the two basins are larger for the A1B scenario, which suggests that climate change projections will differentiate the basins more so than land use projections. Moving upstream, further upstream in the basin, we found that percent change in runoff depth is very small for both basins, and it's very similar in magnitude, regardless of how different the geology at each one of the sites is. This graph over here shows the percent change in annual runoff depth from historic for A1B scenario on the left side and B1 scenario on the right side. We calculated this for two different scenarios: climate change simulations only and climate change and land use simulations combined together. And these lines over here represent the upper and the lower confidence interval. What we found here is also that basins responded different to future climate change and land use changes at an annual scale. For example, when you take into account the climate change only, what we see is that the South Antillean Basin is decreasing into the future, and the North Antillean Basin is increasing into the future. But when you add land use simulations to the climate change simulations, what we found is that the South Antillean Basin is increasing into the future, and the North Antillean Basin shows not significant changes when the uncertainties are taken into account. And results from this suggest that land use projections may have a larger and contradicting effects to climate change at the annual scale. We also calculate the coefficient of variation, define it as the ratio of the annual standard deviation to the mean annual deviation, to the mean annual. And what we found here is that across the entire basin, there is an increase in variability. What this means is that the wet months are going to be wetter and the dry months are going to get drier. However, what we also saw here is that the green lines representing the South Antillean Basin have higher variability compared to the North Antillean Basin. Results from the vulnerability to water scarcity analysis. We calculated supply and demand at different locations in the basin based on elevation, and we differentiate them at low, mid, and high elevations. At the low elevations, at the main stem of the Santiam, then a little bit farther in the basin, at the mouth of the north and the south Santiam basin, at middle elevations in Mehama in the North Basin and Waterloo, and at higher elevation at Boulder and Deer Creek. This graph represents supply and demand for each one of those locations that I just mentioned. And since we're going to see a couple graphs like this in the next couple slides, I want to walk you through this a little bit. Demand is represented by the black line. You can't really tell in this slide here, but supply is represented by the gray lines. The dark gray represents the future time period, and the light gray represents the current time period. The dashed lines represent the B1 scenario, and the solid lines represent the A1B scenario. And these lines over here are the upper and lower confidence interval. And what I'm trying to point, I'm not going to go into very detail with these graphs, but what I'm trying to point with this is how elevation, water demands, and groundwater interactions relate to vulnerability to water scarcity. So what we found that at low elevations in the basin, vulnerability to water scarcity is different at each site. And even though both sites are very close together and have very similar hydrogeology that are related with groundwater recharge and storage from the alluvial aquifers of the Willamette River. However, at Morgan, which is located about 9 kilometers upstream from the mouth, water demand is substantially higher compared to the other side, making this area vulnerable to water scarcity. And what these results suggest is that at low elevations, vulnerability to water scarcity is driven by high demands rather than lower supplies. Moving a little farther upstream at the mouth of the North Santiam and at the mouth of the South Santiam, we see that water supply is starting to distinguish basins a little bit more, indicating that the North Santiam has more water supply compared to the South Santiam. However, at this site, vulnerability is still being mostly influenced by the intensity of water demands rather than hydrogeology or land use. At mid-elevation sites, what we see is that vulnerability appears to be less sensitive to the intensity of water demands and more sensitive to the amount of water supply. And at the most upstream sites in the basin, we see almost no vulnerability to water scarcity, and this is due to both low water demands at high elevations and the intensity of groundwater interactions. So this figure over here is a little bit of a summary of vulnerable areas in the entire basin for each time period, each climate scenario, and each land use scenario. And what we see here, the tan color represents areas that are not vulnerable. The brown color represents areas that are vulnerable in the current time period. The gray areas represent areas, the gray color represents areas that are going to be vulnerable in the future, and the green represents vulnerability for both current and future time period. And what we see here is that vulnerability is different at each scenario, in each scenario, and across the basin. And also vulnerability tends to decrease. There's less vulnerable areas moving farther upstream in the basin. And as I mentioned before, the reason for this is because there's lower water demands at higher elevations and more interactions with groundwater. So my key conclusions are that seasonal and annual runoff responses vary to climate change and land use, vary with each basin based on hydrogeology and elevation and land use changes. Annual runoff variability is increasing across the entire basin. However, the degree that that increases is different, and it's influenced by hydrogeology and elevation, indicating more variability for the South Santiam Basin than for the North Santiam Basin. Groundwater connectivity contributes to more sensitivity to climate change and land use changes. Related to the North Santiam Basin, which has greater groundwater connectivity, the South Santiam Basin is experiencing larger increases in winter in annual runoff and larger decreases in summer runoff. Also, that across the entire basin, land use projections have less effect on stream flow variability and monthly percentage change. However, at the annual scale, it tends to have more influence on hydrologic responses. Vulnerability to water scarcity demonstrated to be influenced completely by the intensity of water demands. However, lower at the basin, vulnerability is dominated by water demands, but as you move upstream in the basin, it shows to be dominated by the amount of water supply and intensity of groundwater interactions. And with that, I'll take any comments, questions.